Well, today we get to move into chapter 4 in the story. The story is the book that we are reading over this year. So I have a copy of it here, and there's more copies available at the welcome desk after the service if you still need one. But we're looking at a different chapter every week as we read through the Bible chronologically together, and that's what the story is a chronological book, chronological version of the Bible that's put together for us. So we moved through a number of different chapters, just the first 3, and heard the stories of the creation of the world, of Abraham, as well as Joseph. And today we move into one of the great stories of the Old Testament in chapter 4, into the life of Moses. We get to talk about the life of Moses together this morning. I have just a few interesting tidbits that I want to tell you about Moses today. So these are things that you may or may not know, and I just thought that they were very interesting, and so I thought I would share them. Did you know that Moses was the baby of the family? He was the youngest in his family. So his older brother was Aaron, who plays a part in the story, and he had an older sister named Miriam as well. But he was the young'un, he was the little one. Did you know also that Moses probably was a stutterer? So when we're going to read the passage today where this comes up, but in Exodus chapter 4, it says, he says to God, he says, I get tongue-tied and my words get tangled. That's kind of a literal translation. The New Living Version translates it that way. NIV says that I have trouble speaking is basically what they say. But he probably wasn't an eloquent speaker. Did you also know that when the story begins of him being called to go back to Egypt and rescue his people, he was probably about 80 years old at that time. And so as we read through the story this week and next week in the book of Exodus, he's going to do things that aren't typical of your regular octogenarian. He's older and much older. You know, where most people today at his age would be firmly ensconced in their rocking chairs, not for Moses. He lived in Pharaoh's court until he was about 40, and then he fled into the desert and became a shepherd for the next 40 years. And when God comes and meets him at the burning bush, as we'll read about today, he was probably about 80 years old and lived for another 40 years till about 120. And it's recorded that he probably had perfect eyesight and incredible strength even up until his last days, that he was able to see the promised land in those days. He wasn't your typical octogenarian. He was also incredibly humble. In Numbers, it recognizes Moses as being a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. That's what it says. He was an extremely humble person. And we also see at the end of Deuteronomy that Moses was buried on a mountain by God himself. That's what we read, that God buried him on a mountain and his grave was never found by anyone. It was somewhere in the Moab, in the valley of Peor, lie the bones of one of the greatest heroes of our faith, and that would be Moses himself. Just some interesting facts that I learned as I was studying for today, interesting things about Moses. And they help us to understand a better picture of what's going on here, that he wasn't a spry young man, that he wasn't just beginning out his journey in life, that he wasn't someone who was already involved in the politics of the day, but he was far from it. I have a question for you as we begin today. Have you ever wondered, why me? Why me? Have you ever wondered if you were made for something more, or why is God asking you to do something? Have you ever wondered why you are experiencing tragedy like no one else is experiencing? Have you ever wondered why you are here? Or have you ever wondered why God could use you? How many of you have ever wondered questions like that? For sure. I think we all have, haven't we? Why am I put here for this situation and at this time? God, why are you asking me to do this? We've all had those promptings where God has pushed us. The Holy Spirit has worked in us in some way, and be it small, be it big, and you begin to wonder, why me, God? Why not someone else? Why are you asking me to do that? See, our lives are not easy. The world is not easy. These days are not easy to live in. But we need to recognize that God could use us even in the midst of difficult days. And this is what Moses was dealing with as well. Why would God choose me, is what he wondered. See, Moses too was born during difficult times. Abraham had left his home country almost 600 years earlier. So it was only 2 weeks ago for us in our sermons, but 600 years has passed in the story of God to this point in time. He left his homeland for a promise of God, a promise from God that God would make him a great nation and that God would do great things and bless the world through his offspring. And now 600 years later, there is a great nation, but they're trapped and they're enslaved in the country of Egypt, in a foreign land. You know, if I was writing the story of God, there are so many things that I would have done differently. Because God, I may not have chosen Abraham, I would have chosen someone younger. I may not have given him one son, but many sons, so that the story could grow quicker. In the story of Joseph that we talked about last week, who he was sold into slavery by his brothers, I can think of much better ways to build a nation than to have your siblings fighting like that. There are much better things that we could do. There are much better ways of growing a nation than to enslave them in a foreign land and a foreign country for hundreds of years. And it was about 400 years that they were in Egypt, just over 400 years that they were in Egypt during this time, in this foreign land and with a foreign people. But when we take a step back from the situation and look at it from God's point of view, he did exactly what he told Abraham he would do. He told Abraham that his people would be in a foreign land and be enslaved by foreign people for about 400 years. He says that in the book of Genesis, and it's exactly what happened and exactly what came true. And from God's point of view, he took his people and grew them to a large nation in a land where they could grow completely on their own without a lot of mixing with other nations. So when he took them out of the land of Canaan and moved them into Joseph's family into Egypt, the Egyptians looked on them with disdain because they were shepherds, and that was a lowly position. And so there was no intermixing of families or marriages. They had their own land and their own place to live. And even as they became slaves in that nation, the harder they were treated, the worse they were treated, the more they grew in number, into, some estimate, into the millions of people that were enslaved in Egypt during that time. But they grew a nation in a foreign land, all on their own, and all with God's design and God's plan. And it came to the point where the Egyptian people had long forgot about who Joseph was and what he did for them hundreds of years earlier. All they saw was a large nation that could either leave them or overthrow them. And so they put them in a place of treating them extremely harshly as slaves. They put slave masters over them and began to work them harder and began to do horrific things to them and to their families. And that's how Moses' story begins. He was saved as an infant from one of the commands of the Pharaoh at the time. They recognized that this nation of Israelites was growing so big and so broad that he made a decree that all male infants were to be killed. All male Hebrew infants were to be killed. And so the story of Moses begins where his mother at 3 months old takes him and makes a basket for him, and his sister goes and places it in the water in the river, and Pharaoh's daughter finds him in that basket floating in the water, and he is saved because of that. He's taken into the Pharaoh's household and given a place where he can grow and he can learn and he can be safe. And that begins the story of Moses. He was saved as an infant. He was raised as a king. And then at about 40 years old, as he was out walking, he saw an Israelite and an Egyptian fighting. And he went and he killed that Egyptian for how he was treating that Israelite, that Hebrew brother of his. And the next day it is found out what he did. And he thought nobody had saw him, but it's found out, as all of our sins eventually are. And he flees the country because of it, because Pharaoh wants to punish him for it, wants him to pay the price, which would have been death for that as well. And so he fled like a criminal as well from his land. And he fled for another 40 years before we pick up the story, from the time Moses fled until the time that God comes to him. We need to remember that God does not abandon and God does not forget. In Exodus chapter 2 is where we're going to start the story today. In Exodus chapter 2, we read this verse. And I believe it's page 45 in your storybooks if you want to follow along. But this is what we read in Exodus chapter 22, or chapter 2, verses 23 to 25. It says, "During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. So he looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. God did not abandon them, and God did not forget them, even though hundreds of years had passed. He was still hearing them, he still was there with them, and he still remembered what he had promised them. God does not abandon or forget his people or his promises. And Moses is remembered, 80 years old as a shepherd in a foreign land. In the very next verses in chapter 3, we get to pick up the story, and I want to just read it for you. It's a fairly long passage, but in Exodus chapter 3, or page 45 in the story, we get to hear this passage of how God came back to Moses. It says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire within a bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire, that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. At 80 years old, he took the sheep around to this mountain. And on this mountain, he encounters a burning bush. And in that burning bush, he encounters the presence of God. It's holy ground, God says, because he is there dwelling in a physical way in that place and in the presence of Moses. We need to remember and recognize that it is a little different for us today. The New Testament talks about the Spirit of God burning within us like a fire, that the Spirit of God is all around us like a burning fire, and we can interact and dwell with God no matter where we are and no matter what we're doing, because his Spirit was unleashed after Jesus' death on the world in a new and in a fresh way. And so where we sit today, where we stand today, where we head home to tonight can be holy ground. Just like it was with Moses at this time, that God is with us in the same way that he was with Moses, that his presence was there with him. And Moses hid his face from God's presence because it says he was afraid to look at God. We don't have to have the same fear because we have seen God dwell with people in the life of Jesus, and we can experience him dwell with us right now. It's holy ground that we stand on. It's holy ground that we live in. We go a little further in verses 7 through 9. It says, The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. This is what God's promise to him was. He says, I have heard you. I have seen the misery. I am concerned about your suffering, and I have come down to rescue you. This is what he says to Moses. I have seen it. I have heard it. I know you're suffering. I know my people are suffering. And now it's time. Now it's time to move on to the next chapter, the next part of my plan, the next mural in the story as we go forward. He has seen them, he has cared about them, and he has come to rescue them. And that applies to us as well. He has seen us, he cares about us, and he has come. And then the very next verse, in verse 10, he says to Moses, he says, so now go. I am sending you to the Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. How many of you wish that God would speak to you like this? Right? When you're waiting for God's direction in your life, how much clearer can it be? So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Pretty clear and pretty direct, isn't it? Remember that this is coming to an 80-year-old Moses who fled from this land that God is now sending him back to 40 years earlier. This is who this call is coming to. Remember that it's coming out of a burning bush that's burning and not going out. That it's the voice of God speaking to him on the side of a holy mountain as his sheep mill about. But what does Moses do? After he hears the voice of God, after he gets this clear instruction from him, 5 times in a row, Moses says, no, God. This isn't what I want to do. This isn't who I am. I'm not going to do it. That's what Moses does. In the very next verse, in verse 11, but Moses says to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? This is his first objection. Who am I? I'm just a shepherd. I haven't lived there in 4 decades. I don't know who's there. I don't know what's going on. Who am I that I could go and meet with the Pharaoh and talk to him? Who am I that I could stand before him? He's looking for me. He wants to kill me. Do you not remember what happened there? I fled for my life, and now you want me to go back and demand that you let all of the slaves go? That's not something I can do, God. Who am I? God responds to him, and he says, who you are, you'll know who you are by the fact that you worship me on this mountain, and you will come back again and worship me on this mountain. He says, I'm sending you because you know who I am, and you will continue to worship who I am. A couple of verses later, Moses still wasn't pleased with it, and he says to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I tell them then? He's asking God, who are you? Who are you to have this authority over the Pharaoh? Who are you to ask me to go and do this? And God's response to Moses was, you tell them that I am who I am. Tell them that I am has sent you. He goes into a little greater detail, and he reminds him of the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the stories of Moses and what happened in these times. And he says, I'm the God that did all of that. That's who I am. I am who I am. I don't have to explain myself to you except for you to know that I am who I am. Who am I? Moses says. Well, who are you? God continues to tell Moses, he says, you will go into this land, and not only will your people be released, not only will my people be released, but they will be released with the spoils of the country. Just you watch and see, when we walk out of there, we will take everything they have. That's what God said to him. That's who I am. And that's what will happen. Trust me, because I am God. I am who I am. And after that long explanation, in chapter 4, verse 1, Moses again, he says this. He says, what if they don't believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? Why would they believe me? Why would they believe me? If I go back there, they haven't seen me. I fled. I ran away. I left them. I haven't been there to help them in their misery. Why would they believe me? And so God gave him 3 different signs. He took a staff, and that staff, when thrown on the ground, became a snake. And he picked it up, and it became a staff again. He said, this is one of the signs. In fact, if you read it carefully through this verse, it says when God told Moses to throw the staff on the ground and it became a snake, he ran away. It scared him. And God told him to go back, grab it by its tail, and it would become a staff again. And that's what he did. And we know that he performed this sign in front of Pharaoh, alongside of his brother Aaron. The second sign he gave him was, he said, if you put your hand into your cloak and pull it out again, it became leprous. It became white and full of leprosy. And then he put it back inside his cloak and pulled it out again, and it was healed. It was perfectly fine. So that will be a second sign. A third sign will be the ability to turn water into blood. And he showed him that and said, this will be a third sign. If they don't believe you, you give them these signs. And in that day, it was believed that you had a God who was powerful if you could perform a sign, something miraculous, something that was completely out of the ordinary. So if they don't believe you, then show them these things. Tell them that I have sent you and I have given you these abilities. For a snake, and to change your hand, leprous, which would have been scary for them to see and do, and then back to healed immediately, and the ability of turning water into blood. Sometimes we look for signs like this too, don't we? Okay, God, maybe you're asking me to do this. Maybe. But first I need a sign. You ought to show me. You ought to prove yourself. I have to admit that this is me sometimes. Maybe my wife would say quite often. That sometimes I'm a little stubborn. There's an old movie, not too old, but an older movie called Bruce Almighty, and it's a comedic movie. Some of you have seen it, I'm sure. But this is what I think of when I think of the scene of waiting for a sign, is a picture like this. And this comes from the movie, and I recognize it's a little blurry, but Jim Carrey, who's the actor in the movie, is God is calling him to do something, and he's like driving along, and he says, God, just give me a sign, give me a sign. And all of a sudden, there's construction on the road. There's all these signs that say, stop, do not enter, turn around, go back. And he's still not listening. And then this truck cuts him off, almost causes an accident, filled with signs that you can't read, but they say, stop, wrong way, do not enter, dead end. And he keeps going on. He says, God, just give me a sign. What should I do? Where do I go? Sometimes our life is like that, isn't it? God, give me a sign, but not that one. I want a different sign, God. I want this one. That's what it's like. And that's what he did for Moses. He gave him signs that he could take to his people, signs to prove who he was and what he could do. And this still wasn't enough for Moses. This is only the third time that he rejected God. In chapter 4, verse 10, he goes on to say, pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past, nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. Basically saying, I'm not a public speaker. If I have to go and talk to Pharaoh, I'm not good at talking. My words don't work. They don't come out. God, you can find someone much more eloquent than me. Why would you ask me to do this? I am not gifted in this way. God, you didn't make me to speak to other people. How many of us have said that? Yeah. This is the Bible character that I have the most affinity with, believe it or not. God, I am not eloquent. I am slow of tongue and speech. But yet, God called him very clearly, gifted him, gave him signs. And he says, it's not me. There must be someone better else suited to this situation. But that's not what God had in mind. In response, God says to him, if you read it, it's so clear. It says, who do you think created you? It's like, give your head a shake, Moses. I wouldn't ask you to do something that I don't know you are capable of doing, that I don't know that I will be there for you. He says, don't you think I know what you're capable of? Who made your mouth? Who gave you your tongue? Was it not I? Of course I know. Of course I know exactly what's going on. And then finally, he says to him, after God says, I made you this way, I gifted you this way, I want you to do this. In verse 13, he simply says, send someone else. Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else. We could shorten that up and we could just say, no. That's basically what Moses is saying, isn't it? No. The Lord's anger burned against Moses after this, is what we read. And he says, fine, I will send you your brother to go with you, Aaron the Levite. Scripture actually already tells us that Aaron was already on the way to meet Moses. God had already called him there before any of this took place. See, God knew exactly what Moses needed. He knew exactly who he needed there with him. And Aaron was already on the way to meet him. But this is what God said to him. And Moses eventually decided that maybe he could do this. As you read through the story this week, if you haven't read it already, or if you're rereading it for a small group, I encourage you to take note of how many times Aaron actually speaks. There's very few. In fact, Moses takes the lead almost all the way through. There are a few occasions where Aaron speaks, but Moses does exactly what God originally asked him to do in almost every occasion. So how many of you now have an affinity for Moses? A growing connection to him? Where you say things like, God, why me? Are you sure, God? Are you sure this is you speaking to me? Why would you be asking me to do this? Give me a sign that it's you. But if I say that, if I do that, no one will believe me. They'll all think I'm crazy. God, I don't think I'm capable of doing this. Please just send someone else. See, God heard and responded and rescued his people through Moses, one of the least likely candidates for leadership. He wasn't jumping up and down, ready to go back to his people. But this is exactly what God called him to do, and it's exactly what he did during this time. See, in the upper story, God told Abraham 600 years earlier that his people would be part of a grand epic, a grand narrative, and they would be woven into the fabric of the world. His people needed a place to survive, not just the famine in the time of Joseph, but a place to survive and grow and prosper, a place to maintain their purity from all of the other nations around them. And this all happened in Egypt. See, God was growing a nation in this upper story and using Moses for his glory. When we talked about that grand mural, the picture of all of the stories and how they're knit together, this story and everything that happens in Moses' life is perfectly knit and woven into the grand mural of God's design and God's plan. And it even foreshadows again what is going to happen in the future. As Moses went Many of us will recognize that he went and he performed. There were 10 different plagues that happened that God brought down on the people. And the final one was the plague of the death of the firstborn sons of all of the families, where this happened in their nation. But all of the Hebrew sons were saved because they took the blood of a pure and spotless sheep or goat, sacrificed that animal, and put the blood over top of their doorposts. And this became the very first Passover. This was the event that they remembered every year for hundreds of years. This is the event that Jesus was remembering the night that they gathered together, the night before he was betrayed, that God sacrificed the perfect sheep, or that the people sacrificed their perfect sheep so that they could be saved from a death that was coming. Part of God's grand design. And Jesus was the final one to fulfill that place, the final one to come and save them. God took all of the lower story narratives and shows us how he chooses us, he calls us, he works through us, just like he did with Moses. He weaves the stories of these plagues into a grand design and a grand narrative. If you go through and study each of the plagues, each of the things that happened during this time, every one of the plagues that happened directly respond to one of the Egyptian gods that were there, where God said defiantly, "Your God is not real, but I am." Every single plague defeated, conquered, exposed an Egyptian god that was fake, that was not real. And the God of the Hebrews was. And the story carries on even till today in our stories, in my story, and in your story. And the question simply is, what is God calling you to? Because if you're like me, I have responded the same way Moses did on more occasions than I would care to admit. Right? No, God, please send someone else. We're human. We never think we're good enough. We always think someone else could do it better. But God made us, and God chose us, and God uses us. So what is his special assignment, his special calling in your life? You know, you may feel unqualified, but God wouldn't call you if he wasn't going to help you see it through. No matter what that is, no matter where it takes place, no matter who it is that you are being called to talk to, he will give you exactly what you need for each and every situation. What's God calling you to? Because if he's calling you, he will make a way for it to happen, make a way for it to come to fruition in your life, just like he has in mine, just like he has in Moses's. I want to invite the worship team to come back up and lead us in a couple of songs as we close today. Thank you.